Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. We'll get started right away. My name's Andy Tepper, and I'm co-chair of the International Committee here at the festival and part of the Literary Council. And it's a real pleasure to see everyone back here for the book festival, the 14th year of the book festival, and it's a real pleasure. Today's program is called My Brother's Keeper, Tragedy and Trauma. It's probably one of the darker panels we've had at the festival. But hopefully it won't be too depressing on such a sunny day. I just want to say briefly, the panel, the topic is not just about death and dying, but about the response, grief, mourning, how survivors survive, and how trauma is felt, remembered, and passed on by individuals, by families, by lovers, by communities, in both fiction and nonfiction. So the authors today, I'm very, very happy to have Maria Tumarkin, who was born in the former Soviet Union in the Ukraine, emigrated to Australia when she was 12. She's the author of several books.
16, she said.
16? She's a writer and cultural historian. She's the author of 3 previous books of ideas, Traumascapes, Courage, and Other Land. And her most recent book, out now, is Axiomatic. David Chariandy grew up in Toronto and is now based in Vancouver, and he's the author of 2 novels, Sukuyant and the recent novel Brother, published last year, and also a book of nonfiction, I've Been Meaning to Tell You. And Edwidge Danticat, and he's also Windham Campbell Prize winner, who's just come from the Windham Campbell Festival. Edwidge Danticat, of course, as you know, is the author of several novels, short story collections, essays, books for young adults and children, Breath, Eyes, Memory, The Farming of Bones, Crick Crack, books of nonfiction, The Art of Death, Brother, I'm Dying. She's the 2018 Neustadt, she won the 2018 Neustadt International Prize for Literature. And she also won the Bobby Prize here at the Brooklyn Festival several years ago. So it's a real pleasure to have the 2 of you here in Brooklyn, and Edwidge to have you back home in Brooklyn. Of course, you're on the Hall of Fame, the Wall of Fame at the Brooklyn Library, and it's always a pleasure. So I wanted to begin by asking David, to ask him a question about Brother. The book revolves around a young man, Michael, who's still coping with his older brother's death that happened 10 years earlier, as is his mother and old friends, Aisha and other friends, in the neighborhood in the outskirts of Toronto called Scarborough. Michael speaks of their complicated grief. And I wanted to ask you, tell us what is complicated grief, and what are the circumstances that complicates it in this instance?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have to begin by saying I'm so profoundly honored to be on this panel. Complicated grief, as I understand it, is a medical term, and I'm not a doctor. I don't have a medical background, but I believe it applies to circumstances when a death is so difficult and traumatic, it becomes difficult to properly mourn the death and thus get over it. And so complicated grief can take on symptoms like disorientation, an unwillingness to recognize and acknowledge what has happened. And I guess I found that term, the term in the novel appears when a doctor diagnoses the mother with as having complicated grief. And I guess it's because the older brother has died through traumatic violence, through the violence of the state. And that death and what has caused that death has not been acknowledged. And so both for the family, the younger brother of the older brother who's passed away, and of course for the mother, it becomes incredibly difficult to deal with this loss.
Yeah, and Maria, your book is a collection of essays and reportage and memoir, diverse subjects, but they're linked by this theme in a way of grief and trauma. And the first essay is called Time Heals All Wounds, and it's about teenage suicides in high schools in Australia. So tell us about this idea that, of course, time does not heal the wounds. The wounds remain.
And David, I'm not just repeating what you've said, but it's an absolute honor to be here with the two of you and with Andy. Thank you. And just to be in this room. I'm a first-generation migrant, and we immigrated from the former USSR to Australia when I was 16. Could have been 12, but... And I'm really interested in a couple of things around grief. One is grief around, as connected to teenagers, as connected to young people. And I think I'm thinking about the younger brother in your book, David. I'm also interested in how grief leaves and travels and moves around and gets stuck in migrant families. Because I think the idea of the good migrant or a good refugee and a grateful migrant and grateful refugee, whatever, both the kind of externally imposed and the internalized ideas, they do not leave much space at all for grief. Because to grieve is to be ungrateful. To grieve is to look towards the past from which you were rescued by this new country, which of course is, completely untrue. I know I'm not talking about my book, but I believe that festivals are not there to promote books, right? But to promote ideas and conversations. So I'm thinking about how I can connect with Edwidge and David here. So I'm really interested in what happens when grief is not expressed by the first generation, then it kind of travels in that unrecognized, unspoken, potent, powerful, but kind of suppressed way to the second generation, where it kind of often gets expressed through anger, because as Anne Carson tells us, grief and anger sit very close together, right? And this is something, so I'm just kind of like in my work, I'm really interested in that kind of thing. And of course I come from the country where millions of people couldn't grieve in the former USSR, people who were taken, and we're talking about millions of people who were in gulags, who were taken away and who died and perished during the particularly 1930s, but across the whole kind of span of the 70 years of the Soviet history, their families did not know the time of their death, the place of their death, the cause of their death. They didn't have the bodies. And so what happens to a country, and how many countries can we say this about? So many countries. What happens to countries where people do not have the bodies, the time and the place of the death? So the living cannot be properly living, because to be a living person is to fulfill your obligations to the dead, and the dead cannot be properly dead because they're not buried and they're not, they're not acknowledged as the dead by the living. So you have countries of ghosts as well. So grief to me is a kind of this complicated vortex that I keep circling around in my work. And just very quickly to come back to the question that you asked, I'm just really interested in the idea of time, which is what the first chapter, it's not actually a book of essays. It's an integrated book, just doesn't work like many nonfiction works do, but it's an integrated work. So it's the first chapter, and in the first chapter, I'm interested in this relationship between time and grief, and this idea that has been around forever, that with certain kinds of pain, only time can do something. Can, perhaps not make it go away, but perhaps it can lessen it or make it go, or make us grow around that kind of pain and make it a little bit more tolerable. So this is what I am trying to understand as I follow around a young woman who lost her sister to suicide, who found her sister in the closet. And I'm sorry if there are people here who are affected by this, and I acknowledge what you are living with and what your families are living with. So what happens? What happens to this young woman who, the parents are gone. The parents are forever smashed by that. The parents can never get up from that kind of death. But what about a young person who was 18? And that's and the sister was a year younger. And this is what I am interested, and I'm interested not in sort of saying time heals or time doesn't heal, just to ask, what does time do? So that's a very long answer.
Yeah, you have another piece called "Give Me a Child Before the Age of 7, and I Will Show You the Woman." And Vera, the character, talks about unresolved walking trauma. And Edwidge, I was struck also in your book. There are several young characters, children, who survive trauma, and in fact, there's one in 7 Stories who is the age of 7. And in your previous novel, Claire of the Sea Light, the daughter, the young girl is 7. Tell us about writing about children who survive trauma and how you do that from the inside. And this book called Everything Inside is a very internal perspective.
Well, first of all, it's really wonderful to be here with all of you, and thank you for all of you for coming. As both David and Maria were speaking, I was thinking, first of all, I didn't know that complicated grief was an actual medical term, I thought. And then to also think about the silence between the generations. I think a lot of people, for example, in the case of my family and other family like ours, our big generational trauma was the dictatorship in Haiti, which lasted 30 years, and then the years that followed, and then most recently the earthquake, and there have been some recent events. But one of the things that, for example, my dad used to always say is that we never have time to pause, to really linger too much on one type of grief before the next one shows up. So I too was interested in what that does in childhood, and that story that you mentioned, 7 Stories, it's the 2 women who meet when they're 7, and they play this game of like tracing their lives through the 7 years that they've been alive. So I do believe too that they're probably like, and they bear out this theory that you could have seen from the time that they were 7 the women that they would become, because so much of their 7 years, both their 7 years, was defined by a kind of trauma. But I'm also interested in generational grief and how sometimes the silence of one generation prevents the next generation from even knowing what the full horrors are, in order to even be able to grieve with the previous generation. So rather than there's like a unity in grief, there's a parting of ways that sometimes manifest in one generation in silence, and then later in anger because you're not grateful, you don't understand what we sacrificed for you to get here. But the young ones are saying, but you never told me.
Yeah, I was struck, Edwidge, also in your book that there's several different ways of dying in the book that seem, besides the political assassination, the young girl in that story, her father is assassinated. But there's other ways that seem to are linked to larger social and even natural forces. There's the 2010 earthquake that kills a wife and the children, and then there's also there's a father who drowns on his way trying to emigrate, trying to flee Haiti and make it to Miami, leaving a son, a very damaged son. Tell me about some of these other different different cases and ways of death and trauma.
I was trying to think of some jokes when you were introducing the panel, because you were like, it's going to be the most depressing panel. And I'm thinking, we didn't pick the topic. I wrote a book after my mom passed away. I wrote a book called The Art of Death, which it was a way for me to grieve actually through reading books and seeing the different ways that different writers have written about death. But what I came away from the experience of writing that book was how much life is endued in death as well, and what makes grief is the fact that what we have lost, and sort of how writers have, like, even as you're writing about death, you're writing about grief, but that can only exist in parallel to also drawing a vibrant life. So we know that death is a reality of life, right? And so what I try to do in the stories, and what I try to do in general when I write about death, is to come up with sort of what that means, what that life meant, what we have lost. And I think that's what runs through all the deaths that I write about, that it's not just to, I used to call myself, I said when I was starting to write, before I had lost a lot of people in my life, I was like a serial murderer, because I could just like knock off characters. But I think as you have more actual grief yourself, you do that more reluctantly, because the burden, the weight of that life sees the death that you're, as a writer, creating becomes much, much more balanced.
I want to go back, Maria, to you were talking about immigrant communities, the communities, and specifically, David, your community of Scarborough outside Toronto. Tell us more about that, what it was in the 80s and what it is now.
It's, I guess, so Scarborough was originally, I guess it's different. There's a different geography regarding the suburbs, I think, in the U.S. and Canada. In Canada, it follows, in a sense, the European model, where the core of the city is where the wealthy people live, and by and large, largely white people. And it's the suburbs where working class people, working poor people, and racialized people live generally in Canada. And so I'm writing about Scarborough, which is precisely that last sort of place. And these are brothers who have a black mother and a South Asian father, and in the context that they're growing up in, they look slightly different, as can happen between brothers, but they're read as black. And this is a community that's heavily surveyed, heavily policed. And there's a threat of violence that hovers over these boys in an everyday way. And the book is about all kinds of ways in which these type of children have to negotiate a negative and sometimes outright violent gaze. For me, and that's the kind of the space that they're moving in, the atmosphere, the weather that they're negotiating, because it's all enveloping, it's all around them in schools
and this is
everywhere.
What time period?
Oh, this
late
is
80s?
Late 80s, early 90s.
90s.
So Canada only lifted its laws prohibiting people of non-white background to migrate easily to Canada in 1967. My mother came as a domestic worker in 1963, and so saw Canada was very different from the Canada that is now. But now, in that period, Canada is now suddenly flipped. Major cities, especially Toronto. And so there's ever more apprehension at this sudden, blackening, browning of the cities that were once very familiar, and all the more is there this threat, this atmosphere. But I want to say this one thing about, ultimately, the older brother does. I don't think I'm ruining the book, because it's there. The older brother does.
Yeah, right from the beginning, you're foreshadowing.
Yeah, the older brother has died. The older brother has died likely through some act. We know what that violence is out there, and how the ways in which a black person can be subject to forms of violence from the state, from authority, in all sorts of ways. But for me, the challenge in writing this novel is capturing another story. I don't actually represent the death of the brother, and that's not only because the moment is so traumatic to the speaker of the book that you just push it out of your mind. You don't remember it. How can you remember that moment, even if you were there witnessing it? But it's also because I don't want to represent it. I think there's enough representations of violence to black people and brown people out there in the world. I don't have to add to that in any sort of way. I don't want to neglect that in any sort of way. I don't want to neglect that reality. And so what I wanted to capture is instead a story of, for instance, tenderness and love between black boys when they are seen as frightening, falsely violent figures of threat. What about the actual love that they have braved in an everyday way amongst themselves, with their friends? What about the joy that they have made in their lives, carved it out in situations in which they are. And so, yeah, the novel is about trauma, and that these, how we work through trauma, and how it's, it's circuitous. I don't think I can tell a traumatic, talk about a traumatic event in a linear way, so it has to be kind of circling around, drawing on the past, drawing on the future, trying to piece together something. But I wanted this novel to be ultimately about love in the midst of it all.
And Maria, to go back to this idea of the immigrant communities, you write about, in Melbourne, several different communities. One character you follow is a Vietnamese refugee, and she tells her story. And of course, there's Russian immigrants and Holocaust survivors that are living in Australia now. Tell me about the different communities.
I just wanted to say something in relation to what Edwidge said about, what happens when new kinds of grief keep coming. And in some years ago, I came across this idea of backlog of grief in one of the indigenous communities in Australia.
Yeah.
This idea that if you take the notion of grief seriously, you need time to grieve, and you need space to grieve, and that time and space need to be set aside from the kind of daily life, right? But the new stuff happens, and the new catastrophe, and the new loss, and you get this traffic jam of grief, and then it explodes, and it explodes in other kinds of loss and so forth. So I just felt this, I wanted to pick up on this idea. But in terms of some of the people who populate my book, Naji Chu, who you mentioned, who's a Vietnamese refugee, I was really interested in people who have, because we have this, the book is structured, it's a book of nonfiction, so I think I have to talk differently about it to the way Edwidge and David are talking about their books. So I have to kind of contextualize it a little bit, but the axiom that kind of sits on top of that particular chapter, this idea that, give me a child before the age of 7, this idea that somehow we're finished, we're complete, something formative happens to us as children, and then we kind of cannot escape it. And life chips away at us and kind of changes us at the edges, but our core is formed. And this idea, the maxim itself is a Jesuit maxim, but that idea that something happens in our childhood has been around for a long time, ever since we invented the idea of childhood, which of course is an invention, and it hasn't been around forever either. And so I've been interested, the two people I talk about in that chapter had kind of huge, all transformative, world-smashing events happened to them at the age of 7. For Naji Chu, they escaped Vietnam and ended up in a series of detention centers in Thailand, waiting, to see if any of the quote-unquote civilized countries would take them on. And for Vera Vasovsky, the Holocaust survivor, who kind of takes up the most oxygen in that chapter, they were hiding during the Holocaust in Poland, and she actually had to administer poison to her father, and because her father begged her, that was the only dignified death that he could have in that particular historical moment. And so the idea of a child of 7 assisting her father in the name of dignity, because there is dignity in death as there is dignity in life, and a child doing that kind of service to a father, that just blew my mind. And she's in her 80s, and I kind of needed to find her and to ask her or to kind of circle around her to see what she has become, what has been forged, what kind of character has been forged out of that experience at the age of 7. So on top of the Holocaust, on top of the hiding, on top of all of that moment when she had to do that, she killed her father. So that just, that's what's in that chapter.
There's a quote, and I forget which piece, but where you say, we writers, we lift some of the burden. This idea of this weight. So I wanted to ask you all about this role of literature. And Edwidge, of course, you've really confronted it in The Art of Death, this book. But what is the role of literature in lifting this weight?
I don't know if literature lifts it, fiction or nonfiction completely, but and that's one of the things I was also trying to figure out in the book, how it sort of gives us different entry points into grief, and it's true that in our, and certain, like when my mother's mother died, she wore black for a certain period of time. There were some rituals that when my mother died, like 3 days later, I think, people were calling, said, I know your mom died, but, and then they would so we're supposed to bounce back so quickly through grief that for me, one, because I wasn't part of some very specific rituals that maybe I would have been part of in Haiti, that, where, you were embraced by the community for a period of time, you were pulled out to just do your grieving, where I had to jump back into my life. I thought, I'm going to create that through books. And I did find some channels, like some echoes of things that, like I would read something and feel like, oh, this is exactly what I'm feeling, and I would feel less alone. So I feel like in that my very specific journey of my particular kind of grief, I did find that there's a kind of ritual in reading, and then sort of echoes in the things that I was reading that I feel like modern life doesn't allow anymore so much.
And David, I'm interested in maybe it's not grieving, but the sense of, well, maybe it is complicated grief, the mother, and it's a borderline with dementia as well. It's kind of an illness. And of course, you deal with that much more in the first novel, in Sukuyan. And Edwidge in Sunrise, Sunset, you deal with some of these ideas. So tell me about the mother and that thin line between madness, illness, and grieving.
I get my novel is in the first person, and it's the younger brother's effort to tell the story, and I guess increasingly in writing the novel, I wanted to attempt in a very humble but a very very serious way acknowledge how a son can attempt to see his mother, and in a situation when certainly what she is experiencing is unimaginable and doesn't fall in the same way upon him as it does upon her. But I guess just that effort, I really to acknowledge that she is being observed, her pain is being acknowledged, and that even when that the relationship becomes such that it is difficult for each of them to openly speak about what has happened, and also to openly speak about the pain that they feel and they observe in each other. I guess because it's in first person, you can hear the son's thoughts, the way that he formulates what is happening. And I mean, this is a story about something that they both equally have experienced, the loss of a loved one. But I mean, something resonated for me in that question of generational grief. And I think in my first novel, that's really what it was. It was the son picking up on a mother's untold story about grief. Even though the mother had not told the son explicitly anything, are there ways in which children read the grief of their parents, even when, especially when, they do not openly share that? They see in some sort of form the gaps in the story, the moods, at times the forms of violence that re-echo. And I guess I've always been really fascinated with that. If you're interested in or come from family that have their own untold stories, and they just simply do not want to pass that on because they think they have provided for you a new life elsewhere, then I think the children are much more wise and observant than parents hope they are. And I think parents even know that too. I think they know that they're not holding the secret as closely as they think they are. But it's been something that I've been thinking through.
Edwidge, tell us more about your story, Sunrise, Sunset, and the character, the main character, and what you were trying to approach in that story, and the different perspectives, also generational.
Well, in Sunrise, Sunset, there's a mother who is gradually going through dementia in the early stages, and then the daughter who has a postpartum depression, and the story is written from both their perspective, but you have a feeling, and it goes back to these silences, that if they shared the information that's in either of their sections, they would have a better relationship. And so for the mother, it's sort of like the daughter's ungrateful, she's had too easy a life, and then the daughter thinks the mother has had, sort of overplaying the vague tragedies of her past, which is not detailed. But what I came away from, I started writing that story when we had a family friend who had a similar situation, and then the doctor, we were all taking turns when her daughter couldn't go, and then the doctor said, she's not a good historian. And I had never heard that term used before in a medical setting, where being if you're a good historian, you can tell your medical history clearly. And so for me, I thought it was so powerful, this notion of being a historian in this medical setting. And that's how it's like neither of them is a good historian. And how good are we, all of us, at the different types of history, especially traumatic history. So that notion of sometimes a term will captivate you in a setting. So that term, the good historian, for me was what led me down this experience of memory, rememory, and trauma.
Maria, you speak about also the children of Holocaust survivors in Australia, this idea of scars. They have scars without the wounds. And there's a particular case, a criminal case you write about. I want you to tell us about the grandmother who ends up kidnapping her grandson, right? And hiding him in her house in Australia. Yeah.
So there are two child Holocaust survivors in my book. This is the second one, and she was in fact born in 1943 in Warsaw, at the time when nothing Jewish was born in Warsaw and everything Jewish was killed in Warsaw. And her whole family perished apart from her mother and herself, and they hid in a pit where potatoes are stored in winter, and a Catholic Polish woman actually protected them and saved them. The woman ended up in Australia, and she ended up having a son. She ended up marrying one of the sons of the woman who rescued them. They immigrated to Australia eventually, and the son passed away, but the grandson was living with them, and through a whole kind of complicated set of circumstances, her grandson ended up with his own mother, who was in a relationship with a very violent offender. And no one was, the institutions of the Australian state that were supposed to protect the grandson in this country. She escaped the Holocaust, she escaped the Europe that kind of betrayed her sense of what human beings are to each other and what institutions are there and what they're meant to do in relation to children. So she's in Australia, in this place where children should be safe, and her grandson, who she has the kind of primary responsibility for, is being abused in a terrible manner. She goes to various institutions. They are silent, they are deaf and mute, they are not interested, and she ends up kidnapping the son and hiding him and so forth. And I wanted to write about it because, well, first of all, because that story gripped me, and because she ended up in jail, and it was...
When did it happen?
So it happened in the 90s, in 1990s. And she ended up in jail, and she's an artist, and she didn't actually want to get out of jail because she was painting like crazy. She was just like, she's like, why would I want to be anywhere else? I'm just, anyway. And she said, I am a survivor they, you know, what can they do to me, especially in an Australian jail after everything my family has been through? It's a, you know, walk in the park. But the reason why I wanted to write about her, because I think the language of trauma can sometimes be a way of not seeing what's going on. I mean, it's a kind of, so to think of her, or, you know, she hides her grandson because, you know, she was a baby who was hidden, and that's the only language, a kind of pre-linguistic, pre-cognitive language that she understands, the language of hiding. Well, that's bullshit. I mean, she's hiding him to protect him because no one else will. And so trauma kind of creates a smokescreen where we're like, oh, the survivor, she's acting out, she's traumatized, you know, she treats Australia as a kind of a version of, you know, Germany in the 30s and 40s, completely untrue. So I wanted to talk about different kinds of trauma as we understand it, where it's a moment of rupture, trauma that I think David and Edwidge, you know, if I understand your work correctly, that kind of trauma is in your work, which is kind of structural trauma of being born in your life, being born in your body, being born in your family, where there is no one event where the whole world is splintered in the before and after. But also trauma is a problem. Trauma as a way of actually being blind to what's happening and to the new kinds of injustice. Because, and this is a way for me to get her to look at Australia, and she says, which is some of the favorite moments in the book for me, when she says, you are the country of barbarians. You know, you think that you are the country of civilization. No, I look at you and I see you for what you are because you don't know how to protect your own children. So that to me is a moment of, we usually have survivors as kind of, you know, objects. Survivors are being looked at, but this is the survivor looking back, and she's got a lot to say, and that felt powerful.
Do we have any questions in the audience? We'll open it up for a few minutes. Yes. Yeah.
Well, you got pretty far in. I mean, I personally feel like when writing the story, we're at the service of the story, characters in the story. That story will find its readers, and some people will throw it across the room, some people will hate it, but I feel like I have to think first of the characters, not so much the reader. Because if we were thinking about, like, even the assembly here, it would be too many people to consider individually.
I would completely agree with that, but I would add one thing, which is that if, you know, my book, you know, addresses a topic that seems timely, but it's not. You know, state violence, you know, police violence against black people, against brown people is not timely. It's something that's been happening for a long time. It's been brought to attention because of the work of activists that have been incredibly brave, and so mainstream media cannot ignore it, perhaps in this particular moment. But it's not new. But I actually did think about not the reader, but some readers, particular readers, what could be, how to story what is a deeply painful and can be a very personal story for certain people. And that's maybe one of the reasons why I didn't want my, you know, those last 100 pages of Mystery's book, those are, there was a good call, because it doesn't get any easier. It's a great novel, we can, but if you were feeling that way, that was a very good call, because it does not get any easier. But I did want to think about ultimately what I was attempting to write about, and I didn't want to ultimately write about death. I wanted to write about life. And so I wanted to, again, without shirking my responsibility, to be truthful about a feeling and about a reality. I also wanted to capture, as far as I was able, life. And so I was thinking about how particular readers might also need that endorsement of life.
And David, you had mentioned to me before that it took you a while to approach the story in different ways, right?
Yeah. It took me a decade. I worked on this book constantly. Not I was taking breaks. I was every day writing for a decade, partially because I was trying. It's not the only way I want to write a book, but I was just thinking about the consequences of what I was putting out in the world in a very humble terms. A book's a book, but I did think about it, I guess.
Did you cut a lot of things out, or did you write and cut?
I did, yeah. It was really this process of, and because it's non-linear, I kept on rearranging things in endlessly different patterns, but yeah. I don't know if I got it right, but I just did think about it all the time, about all the different ways.
It is a very beautiful book, and it is sparse. You feel that it's been parsed down to the essential. Yeah. Any other question? We have time for... Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to say, Edwidge, you said something about how you read in that immediate aftermath, how you didn't have maybe as many rituals as you would have had at home, but how you read, and how it made you feel less alone. So I think thinking about readers is, for me as a nonfiction writer, is actually understanding. It's not that I'm not trying to protect my readers, and again, fiction and nonfiction is probably different. What I want is for my readers, whether there are like 3 of them in the world or whatever, not to sound self-aggrandizing, but to actually feel less alone. And for that to happen, you have to put down the truth on the page, and the truth has got a lot of pain in it. But I think that to me is the function of literature that I can still believe in. I don't believe in many lofty claims, but I do believe that books make us feel less alone, and you tell the truth to do that.
Thank you all. We have time for another question or two. Yeah?
I heard structural trauma, and then the last bit. Yeah.
I think she wants you to
Shut up, Maria.
She wants you to elaborate on structural trauma.
No, I think you want to hear from Edwidge and David.
No, for you.
Okay, for all of us. Yeah. Don't try to do this, Edwidge. She wants to hear from you and David. Well, just very quickly, I think the idea of trauma came in a particular historical moment, and I think now we're beginning to understand that racism, misogyny, neocolonialism, people living with illnesses and disabilities, and how their lives are structured by trauma. So trauma is not just a death or an act of genocide. Trauma is the perpetual kind of existence of someone who, if I haven't read your book yet, but I've read about, and so forgive me, but I feel like, when I think about the mother, in that book, and I think about this idea, what she's living with as well. So it's not even before her oldest son is taken away from her by the violence of the state. So that's the kind of stuff that I was interested in, and I think we are turning away from this notion of trauma as like one moment of rupture towards lives that are completely kind of determined by this idea, and some people call it non-eventful trauma. That could be another way of thinking about it. But
and I think now there have been studies that poverty, you can get PTSD from growing up in a certain neighborhoods, and that things that are starting to show in like the imprint of people's DNA. So I think even thinking about trauma not just as an event, as you're saying, but as something that literally has gone through the generations, and the longer it carries on, the harder it is to treat, quote unquote. So it manifests in all these different ways.
Did you want to add anything? No? I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for... the authors will be signing out in the lobby, and Greenlight has the books outside.